we have come to the end of our note-taking days for the Civil War unit. And so today we're going to look at the end of the war, like how the war comes to an end, but then also the effects that the Civil War has on the country and different aspects of society. And some of those effects are still working in society today. So one of the reasons that we're going to get to the end of the war is a plan that is going to be designed called the Total War Plan. This is designed by mostly by Grant, Sherman, and Lincoln. And this is the plan to have a complete defeat of Confederate forces and their economy. Because when you put a stranglehold on the economy, it makes everyone suffer, not just the military, not just your leaders for the Confederacy. And kind of discussed this a little bit, but not really into any extent before. But this idea of total war is taking the fight to the civilians. So mostly General Sherman, the Union will be destroying everything in their wake. They're going to burn big parts of Georgia to do this. They're going to pick up the railroad and wrap the railroad around trees, so it's difficult to rebuild your infrastructure easily. And they're going to start attacking they being the Union troops, are going to start attacking Confederate troops from multiple directions. So instead of just meeting in the field of battle, they're actually going to be doing a lot of flanking, different ambush methods to try to break the Confederate lines. There's also something called the Anaconda Plan. This is what really hurts the economy of the South. As you can see right here, an anaconda is the biggest snake, right? I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong. You can see this image of this snake kind of choking off the South, and most of it is revolving around water. And even though this snake, I know you guys can't see me pointing at the screen, but even though this snake is further west of the Mississippi, it's really, the focus is also on controlling the Mississippi River. So the Anaconda Plan, which was designed by General Winfield Scott, calls for a naval blockade of all southern ports, including the Mississippi River. And the goal was to make sure that the South could not get cotton out, that they would not be able to get any weapons or supplies from the British to help them. And so strangling that trade economy is really going to hurt the South. And actually, for a long time, it's going to hurt the South. That starts in 1864. And so by 1865, Lee realizes that there's no way that the South is going to be able to come back. He's had not only his large number of casualties, but he's had so many soldiers desert, go home, people trying to make sure that their families are being taken care of and putting their families before the military. And so it becomes just tactically impossible for the Confederacy to win. So Lee makes a very difficult decision to surrender April 9th, 1865. This is a painting that reenacts Lee's surrender to Ulysses S. Grant. And one of the terms of that surrender is that Confederate generals or Confederate leaders would not be tried for treason. One of the things that we really wanted to do as we're reuniting as a country is try to heal the wounds that we could heal. The things that we could control. And that was something that we could control. So as you can see, there are a lot of effects that are going to come from the Civil War. One of those is the Emancipation Proclamation. We talked about that when we looked at Antietam, and we looked at just the issue of slavery. All slaves in enemy territory are liberated once the war comes to an end. Those individuals are no longer property of the U.S. government, and so they are officially liberated until we get the 13th Amendment that says that slavery can't exist anymore. There's going to be a brand new state that is an effect of the war. West Virginia is going to become a state. West Virginia, I'm not sure how many of you have actually been to Virginia or West Virginia, but excuse me, West Virginia is not very good for agricultural purposes. And so there's really was no need for them to support slavery. In fact, many of the people in that Appalachian region didn't support slavery. We're looking at a heavy mining industry, and they really didn't want to be involved in what was happening with the Civil War. So they decided to become a free state. However, since they joined the Union in 1863 during the war, they had to remain a border state until the war was over. Deaths, I mean, this number is still disputed, but this definitely has a very important impact on the country itself, whether we're talking about the North, the South, even the Western frontier areas where fighting was taking place. Today, the estimate falls anywhere between 600,000 and 800,000 people who died either from combat, from the diseases they got, from the horrible sanitary practices that we had, or from other factors, from suicide, from there were civilians who were just killed in their homes because these battles were taking place in their front yards, and bullets and shells were going through their homes. So not everyone who dies of combat. The numbers, like I said, are still being disputed. There's still a lot of research that's being done, but that's an enormous amount of people. And if the majority of them are men, if you just think about this for a minute, if you take a large section of men out of society, you are actually influencing the way your economy, the way your society will function for the next generation. Because you have people who would have been contributing in industry or building infrastructure or building the country, continuing to build the country, and those people are gone. You have families without providers. So now you have more people who may be in poverty because if the male was the provider, they're out of the picture. And so these deaths have a very far-reaching impact on society for at least a generation. All right, let's talk about these two terms that are also going to have an effect on the country. The first one is the term scallywag. So a scallywag is definitely an insult. You don't want to be called a scallywag. And this is making a reference to a white Southerner who would support what's known as Reconstruction. And we'll be talking more about Reconstruction when we finish our Civil War unit. Reconstruction was a way that the government, the Union, had come up with to try to put the North and the South back together again. And so there were some policies that were disciplining the South. So basically, people saw a scallywag as a traitor. You're a white Southerner and you're okay with Southerners being disciplined. They had problems with that. And scallywags were also forming partnerships with free blacks in the South. And excuse me, their main goal was to make a profit off of Southerners. So they would, for example, go to a plantation. And after the Civil War, rents and taxes on these lands were just astronomical, and people didn't have any money to pay for them. Remember, they had burned their U.S. dollars because they didn't think they would need them anymore, and their Confederate dollars are worthless. So we've got land that probably hasn't been farmed for a few years. We have a lack of labor. And so these scallywags would team up with free blacks, and they would try to buy these properties for pennies on the dollar and just take advantage of people who were in desperate need of anything that they could possibly get. So definitely seen as traitors to their own people in the South. A carpetbagger, someone who's similar. So we're talking again about an insult, but we're talking about Northerners instead, who are seeing ways to make a buck, like these scallywags. And they move down south during Reconstruction. They're called carpetbaggers because they have bags made of carpet. But their goal is to do the exact same thing those scallywags are doing, to make a profit off of poor Southerners who are really struggling. And these scallywags and carpetbaggers are going to make a profit, but some of them are also going to be shot at. Some will be lynched, which we'll talk more about lynching at another date. But they basically are going to make life difficult on people in the South who are trying to rebuild and trying to put their lives back together. One of the probably more far-reaching effects of the Civil War will be the establishment of Jim Crow laws. So if you can look at this caricature, this cartoon that's on the left of your screen, this is a character that comes to be known as Jim Crow. It's a character that was created by a white person in the North that shows blacks as dumb, who basically just serve the purpose of entertaining white people. And from that, I'm not really sure how we make the transition from that to actual laws. We're going to see quite a bit of oppression that actually still takes place in some parts of our country. So Jim Crow laws are, it's a system of government-sanctioned racial oppression and segregation. So these weren't necessarily laws that were on the books, but there were unwritten laws that were created in order to keep blacks and whites separate and in order to create a hierarchy to place whites above blacks. Now, the majority of Jim Crow laws and actions that you're going to see taken on behalf of Jim Crow are going to happen between that Emancipation Proclamation time and the late 1960s. And how these are enforced will also ebb and flow with the type of power that the KKK has. Whoops. All right. I'm going to show you this very quick video that gives you an introduction into Jim Crow and the idea of who he was.
Boys, I'm just from Tuckahoe. I'm going to sing a little song. My name's Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. I went down to the river.
In 1836, Jim Crow is born. He begins his strange career as a malicious minstrel caricature of a black man, created by a white man to amuse white audiences. Jim Crow would come to symbolize one of the most tragic eras of race relations in American history, a time deeply rooted in promise and contradiction. 1865, 4 million Americans, slaves simply because they were born black, were now free. But in little over a decade, that promise was gone, replaced by a rigid system of laws designed to keep blacks from experiencing any of their newly achieved rights. It would be known as the era of Jim Crow, the American form of racial apartheid.
But I tried to lean inside and get me a cup of water. And those white people beat me till I was unconscious. They thought I was dead.
My dad said, as long as you're living in this South, you're going to have to go to the back door in this town. And you just settle for that. He said, but one thing I want you to swear and promise to me, that you will never get used to it.
I'm not ashamed of the segregated and Jim Crow experience, all because we were able to devise techniques for survival that permitted us to abide our time and to wait until our change comes.
As most blacks were willing to bide their time, some began to fight back. In the late 1880s and 90s, they embarked on an uncertain campaign to secure voting rights, build their own communities, schools, businesses, and churches, and to demand redress against mob violence and lynching. The white supremacists fought back. By 1919, the Ku Klux Klan, which had been a Southern idiosyncrasy, became a national ideology. White supremacy, the power behind Jim Crow, appeared invincible. And over the next decade, the violence against blacks would grow even more horrific. But black Americans continued to battle, using the power of the press and ultimately the power of the courts to pursue their quest for freedom and equality against racism. The rise and fall of Jim Crow is their story, the story of strong men and women who would never accept the demeaning, threatening, and perilous world of Jim Crow. The rise and fall of Jim Crow is the story of those who, in the face of unending terror, achieved triumphs. Triumphs that would in time make America a better place, not just for themselves, but for all of us.
Of course, more of that information can be gained if you take modern history, but Jim Crow laws really impacted all areas of society. So you're going to see discrimination against African Americans in education and public places. Basically, if you can think of a place, that's where discrimination would be. And like I said, that does continue in some aspects of society today. Please take modern history so that you can learn about that. Here are some images that you're probably familiar with that are also established during Jim Crow. Separate drinking fountains. And this wasn't only against African Americans. This was also against Latin Americans. We had many people who were here lawfully from Mexico who had immigrated due to farm shortages. They were actually encouraged to come. And they were also treated the same with Jim Crow laws. You can see dogs have a higher place on this sign as being undesirable than blacks and Mexicans. So as I said, if you can think of a place in society, there were separate facilities for blacks and whites. Reconstruction, which we'll talk more about when we are done with our Civil War unit. Reconstruction is going to happen in the South. You can see, in these gray territories. They have years with the names of the states, and those are years where those states are admitted back to the Union. In order for a southern state to come back to the Union, they had to go through a process. And one of the things that they had to do is they had to have a certain percentage of their population sign an amnesty oath. This is Robert E. Lee's amnesty oath. You can see it says, "I, Robert E. Lee, in Lexington, Virginia, do solemnly swear in the presence of Almighty God that I will henceforth initially support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Union of the state thereunder, and that I will, in like manner, abide by and faithfully support all laws and proclamations which have been made during the existing rebellion with reference to the emancipation of slaves, so help me God." He signed that in October of 1865. So you basically had to sign an oath that you understood that you were part of the United States of America, that the Constitution was the supreme law of the land, excuse me, and that you wouldn't have slaves. And by the way, that was 10% of your state's population. Areas that were destroyed during the war were also rebuilt during this Reconstruction time. So certain areas of the South were given federal dollars in order to make that happen. And those areas probably would have had a positive economic impact on the rest of the country. Other areas were not so lucky. They had to find other ways to rebuild without that federal assistance. And these two gentlemen kind of made that tough on the South. This is Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. They're what's known as radical Republicans, in that they took the ideas of Reconstruction that Lincoln had and basically made them about as severe as you can possibly imagine. Lincoln just wanted the Union to come back together, to reunite them. He didn't want to punish the South, but he was dead. So basically, the Republicans who were left could do what they wanted with Lincoln's initial plan. And so they pushed to punish the South for starting the war. And they came up with a lot of oppressive guidelines for the South in order to have states readmitted, in order to have people rejoin Congress from the South. It really was pretty strict. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are going to be passed during this time as well. And so the federal government creates something that's called the Freedmen's Bureau, as you can see down here at the bottom of this image, to make sure that people in those states are enforcing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So the United States government helps to sponsor different organizations that also help teach these freed slaves what it means to be a free individual. I mean, you guys think about it. If you were removed from your home today, would you know everything automatically that you need to know to be an adult to survive in the world? No, absolutely not. That's a learning process. So there's a learning process that goes on that's teaching Blacks what it means to actually be free and have all of these responsibilities and be part of society. And so the Freedmen's Bureau actually helps with that and helps people be able to find work, helps make sure that people are able to vote. Now, I am about to run out of battery life. So when you stop listening to me, I want you to go to Google Classroom and I want you to watch the crash course video that is under this video. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you in class tomorrow.